Thank you for being here. I'm not used to a podium mic. I'm used to having a lapel mic because I walk around a lot, so we'll see how this goes. Hopefully I won't forget that this is here. It's right in my face, so I don't think I should. But I also chose this because I have a tendency to gesticulate a lot, and I didn't want to inadvertently use the microphone to point at something. So hopefully this goes well. Okay, so the title of the talk, I Don't Talk Like That, Research Methods and Ethics for Natural Language Interaction. And you'll kind of see why I chose this title after we sort of get into the linguistic stuff. So really briefly, who am I? Danny already described some of what I do and who I am. I hold a PhD in applied linguistics, language learning, second language acquisition, and sociolinguistics. I'm an author, as she mentioned. I would love it if you all would fill out my survey that was in the interview that I did before this talk today. It doesn't matter if you're actually a designer of a voice or chat-based interaction. That's fine. I'm looking for information from anybody who's willing to share it with me. I also care about accessibility. You'll notice that I don't have super designy slides, and that's because I know that for whatever reason, people just space out, right? They lose their train of thought. They're not able to attend to everything. Maybe they got an email that something at work is on fire and they just forget what they're listening to. They need a little bit of a reminder to get back on track to where we are. So I like to provide anchor text on my slides so that everybody can feel free to space out if they need to for a second, and then they're able to get back to where we are. I also describe my picks and my gifts. I don't really have many in this talk today, but I do that for accessibility reasons, for people with low vision or other sorts of issues where they can't really see what's on the screen. So, just a little background about that. What we're going to talk about today, really briefly, you're going to get a crash course on intro to linguistics. This is a theme that can take an entire semester to talk about and still not hit everything. So this is going to be really condensed. But I feel like it's really important background that you need to have. We're going to talk about a case study, and this is in the research on linguistic discrimination. So it's a case study from a paper. And I'll talk a little bit about considerations for language research, because there are some different considerations when you're doing user experience for language research. We'll touch on quant versus qual, and we all kind of maybe hate that discussion, but it's one that I feel we need to have. And then I will briefly go over a couple of methods. There are so many research methods that are appropriate for use with language that I can't cover all. Again, this is something that could be covered in 1 or 2 semesters worth of a university level class. So I'm just going to go over a couple of them. There's a lot more detail in the book if you're interested, and I will have some information on the book at the end of the talk today. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is, what is language? How do we define language? It's kind of difficult. But it's kind of like porn. You know it when you see it. But it's really hard to write an accurate description of what language is. And I have a couple of them here for you that I pulled. This first one is from a book on linguistics research methods that I have. And the authors here define language as an open, arbitrary, conventional system of sounds used for communication within a linguistic community. And this is great because it touches on the fact that language is arbitrary, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It talks about the fact that it's systematic, which it is. And then it talks about how it's used within a language community or speech community, which is also really important because language is socially situated. But it kind of lacks in that language isn't just sound, right? I mean, there are people who use sign language to communicate. That's not sound, that is gesture-based. And so this definition leaves out sign languages. It also leaves out written languages. And not all languages have a written system, but we need to account for it because there are many that do. This one I took from Merriam-Webster, and it's actually not even the first entry. If you look up language, it's like the 4th or 5th or something like that down on the page. And they have a systematic means of communicating ideas or feelings by the use of conventionalized signs, sounds, gestures, or marks having understood meanings. And this one's a little better because it does include the fact that a lot of communication or a lot of language is not sound-based, right? But we're leaving out the speech community aspect, and we're also leaving out the arbitrariness of language. So you can see it's kind of hard. Merriam-Webster should be able to write an accurate definition of what language is, right? So this kind of shows you how hard it is to write something, a definition, that encompasses all of the ways that we use language. So what do I mean by arbitrary? Standards, language standards, we know all about those, right? Those actually just reflect who had the power at the time the decision was made. And what I mean by that is that, so my degree was done in a department of Spanish and Portuguese, so I know more about the history of Spanish on the Spanish Peninsula than I do about English in the United States. So I'm going to use that as an example. So up until from like the 800s or so until about the 1400s, Arabic was the dominant language in the Spanish Peninsula, and varieties of Arabic. So there's another variety called Mozarabe that was like a hybrid between Arabic and Romance languages that was also very dominant in the peninsula at that time. But then the Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, reconquered the peninsula and imposed their language on the rest of the peninsula, right? So that became, Castellano became the variety that was known as the standard in Spain from then on. And that's completely arbitrary. So if they hadn't been able to impose their language, Arabic might still be the dominant language or the standard in the Spanish Peninsula today. It's just because of the way that conflict turned out that Spanish is, the Castellano variety of Spanish is what is the standard in Spain right now. So that's what I mean by arbitrary. The other thing that I mean by arbitrary is that when you have like a sequence of letters, like D-O-G in English, dog, there's absolutely no reason why D-O-G and the way we pronounce it, dog, should symbolize an animal with 4 legs, tail, pointy ears, and fur. No reason. It just is, right? Because the word for dog is different in another language. Perro in Spanish, cane in Italian. There's no reason why those specific sequences should reflect that concept. It's also really hard, so you've seen how hard it is to define language. It's also really hard to define dialect or variety. And I use the word variety because there is this sense that with dialect, we have the standard that's like at the top of a pyramid, and all of the dialects are below it. And that kind of implies that they're less than or not equal to or worth less. And so I like to use the word variety because then you have the umbrella term like English, for example. And then all of the varieties of English, like Standard American English, Chicano English, African American English, all those things reside on the same plane together, and it's not one is valued more than the other, even though that's the case in most societies. But it's really hard to determine where those things stop and where they begin, and the reason for that is that, again, because it's so hard to write a definition of language, it's really hard to write a definition of what a variety or a dialect is. And these things exist on a continuum. And you can think about it in the way that topography, so how we delineate countries or regions or states or whatever, is completely arbitrary as well. So if you live in the Basque region of Spain and you cross the border into France, there's not going to be suddenly people who have no idea what anything in Basque sounds like. There's gradients of bilingualism along these artificial borders between countries. And so it's really hard to just, delineate these things. They all exist on a continuum. And they exist on the continuum because of social variation. So the way we use language will be different based on who we are, our age, our gender, our race or ethnicity, the context in which we're speaking, the level of formality that's needed at the time. All of these things are going to change the way we talk. And they change it in a rather systematic way. And I just want to point out here that a lot of the research that's been done up until today is basically treating gender as a binary, which is unfortunate, but a lot of people are like, oh, but if I account for all these different ways of identifying gender, it's going to make my analysis really hard. Well, too bad. But there are a lot more researchers in linguistics now who are studying trans voices, who are studying non-binary people and how they use language, and looking at gender as more of a continuum or a way to self-identify rather than a self-imposed binary. So just as a caveat, if you start looking up the linguistics research, you're going to find gender treated as a binary a lot in the previous studies, like historical studies. So because there's all this social stratification of the way language is used, we assign value to those different varieties. So for example, in the United States, and by the way, I want to point out I have a United States bias about this information that I'm talking about because that's where I live, that's where I studied, and that's where I work. So there might be corollaries in where you live, but not necessarily. So just so you know, I am speaking from a place of United States lens. So for example, in the United States, African American English is not valued. It's not considered a prestigious variety by a lot of people. And so we assign value to the people who use that variety. And we encourage people to be bidialectal or bivarietal with standard American English in order to succeed in society because we place that value. And that's true of basically all of the different varieties of English. The standard is usually the most prestigious and the most highly valued, and then the rest of the varieties are kind of thought as less than, depending on who's using them. So we'll use these varieties and we'll use these values to discriminate against people, which sucks. We shouldn't do that. We also, because of this social stratification, we also use our language to identify ourselves or to show who we are or to demonstrate our identities. We can use it to include or exclude people. For example, if you know someone who is bi or multilingual or even multidialectal, a lot of the times if you're in a group with similar people who are bilingual or multidialectal, what have you, if an outsider comes in and the group wants to make sure that that person knows that they're not included in this conversation, they'll switch to the other language that they think that that person doesn't know. That can backfire if that person doesn't fit what you think a person who speaks that language looks like. But yeah, that's how we use that. And another example that I thought was really funny, Trevor Noah was introducing Black Panther at the Oscars, and he said a phrase in this African language, and I'm so sorry, I'm not going to try to pronounce that name. I really tried to practice it, but I don't want to butcher it, so it's here. I can't do the click, that's the problem. Anyway, so he said a phrase in this, and then afterward he said that it means, in times like these, we are stronger when we fight together than when we try to fight apart. And everybody at the Oscars clapped, and they're like, yeah, that's so nice, what a nice sentiment, whatever. But apparently Nigerian Twitter blew up because what he actually said was, white people don't know I'm lying. So that is a way that language is used for in-jokes or to include or exclude people. All the people at the Oscars thought he was saying this really nice, inspirational thing, but he said something very different. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about language being socially constructed. Language is also used to uphold or dismantle ideology. I know some people get kind of like twitchy around the word ideology, but really all that means in the linguistics research is a set of common beliefs that form the basis of your culture. My notes went away. Oh, there they go. So what ideology is the underlying things that seem like common knowledge to people or common sense, right? And it includes stuff like heteronormativity, patriarchy. It can be your religious beliefs. It can be your political beliefs. All of these things are forms of ideology that can be covert or overt. Like you don't understand that you actually hold these beliefs. They just feel like common sense to you based on how you were raised. And it's a recursive process. So you can see to the right here we have this graphic with, it's a circular graphic with arrows. And there's one node that says belief, another node that says language, and another node that says action. So this is representing the recursive process here of how that works, how language upholds ideology. And it's really hard to break this. It's really hard because it's, again, sometimes these things are not overt, they're covert, and people don't understand what they're doing when they're using certain kinds of language. And you'll see that when people get really uncomfortable when you do pushback against things like singular, that would be why they would do pushback against singular they. Like, oh, that's not how it's supposed to be. The neutral is supposed to be he, him, his. Well, but that's upholding a patriarchal ideology, right? So people, when they are confronted with their ideologies, they can get really uncomfortable, and that can make this really hard to break because sometimes they'll double down on the way they talk or the way they use language because they want to push back against your pushback. And a really good example of this too is with racism in language. So say someone has a racist belief and it's not really strong, Like it's just a mild, oh, well, I don't like this group of people. But then they start using maybe coded language or dog whistles. And that might lead them to do something like treat a person of that group a little bit differently, which reinforces their belief because maybe that interaction is negative. And then maybe they start to use more overtly racist language, which then feeds into their actions, which then reinforces their beliefs. So that's kind of how that recursivity works with language. And you can break out of it, but again, it's really hard because people don't want to stop doing the things that they like doing or they're used to doing. So you can see that linguistic discrimination is a thing. And we also use linguistic discrimination in the way we talk about bilingualism. So I did an interview with a couple of other linguists. They're really rad people, and you should listen to it if you're interested in this topic. The episode is called Bilingualism Isn't Just for White Kids, because the way we talk about bilingualism in the United States is that it's good for white kids, right? It'll make their brains more plastic. They'll have an advantage when they apply to colleges. They'll be able to be global citizens, blah, blah, blah. But then when we have immigrants who come to the United States and don't speak English, we want to punish them for not acquiring English fast enough. And we want to punish their home language out of them. So bilingualism is really only used to promote white children's learning. And that sucks. And it also influences how we talk about other varieties. So I don't know, this is gonna date me, probably age me, but many years ago there was this thing in the national discourse in the United States about ebonics. And people were talking about how it was like broken English and all that stuff. But African American English is actually systematic and rule governed. And so there was no reason to be talking about that variety in that way. It's perfectly valid. It is a variety. It's a valid variety. And people were using that to discriminate against folks who use that variety. Whoops. Okay, so we use that language as a weapon, right, in various different ways. If we have someone that speaks a variety that has no prestige where we live and work, that person is probably less likely to get an interview for a job or a promotion once they're in the job, or allowed to do certain activities because of the way they speak, because it won't look good when they're out being the face of the company. So we use language as a weapon as well. So here's the case study. It's a little depressing. These three researchers, John Baugh, and I don't remember the other two researchers' names, conducted this study where Baugh actually did a matched guise test. And a matched guise test is where the same person who is multilingual or multidialectal records the exact same speech or utterance in all three, in this case, of their varieties. And then they play those three varieties to the same people to see how they would either rate or respond to those three different varieties. And this is interesting because it controls for speaker. So you can't say that the speaker is a confounding factor because it's the same person. So he did this with his three varieties, Chicano English, Standard American English, and African American English, and he called landlords in the San Francisco Bay Area and property managers to try to inquire about getting an appointment to view an apartment. And there were hundreds of them. He called hundreds of people. And what he said, he started off every single call, and these were recorded too. He started off every single call with, hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper. So he called each person 3 times and used the different guys each time so that he could have that data. So, surprisingly, the varieties with the least success were the Chicano English and the African American English. And the most success, by far, it was a significant difference and a significant jump in number of acceptances for an appointment was Standard American English. And so then he performed a second experiment with that data, with those recordings. He took his recordings of himself saying, hello, I'm calling about blah, blah, blah. But he took just the hello part out and then had 50 participants listen to that. 70% of the time, people were able to accurately identify what variety it was based on one word. One word. That's all it took for people. And that was a statistically significant difference. And there's other research now that shows that it's even less, it's like milliseconds worth of speech before people can recognize what variety is being spoken. So that's pretty significant. And it leads me into privacy and informed consent, because language data is personal data. If we can identify the variety in less than 1 second's worth of speech data, we could probably start to identify individual people, right? And so that's a problem. We need to treat speech data and other language data like personal data. Absolutely. You need to treat it like any other type of personal data. You need to guard it with your life, because this is people's personal data. It is them. It is how they identify. It is who they are. And you need to make sure that your participants understand what they're agreeing to do if you're asking them to do linguistic research or language research with you. And it's even more important if you're going into a marginalized community who speak a variety of language that's not prestigious in your country or state or whatever. You need to make sure that they understand what it is you're doing, why you need the data, and what you'll be doing with it afterward. And be transparent about who will have access to it, right? So like, they know whether their data is going to be fed into an algorithm, a machine learning algorithm. They know whether their data will be used to create dialogues. They know what all of this will be used for. And I have a real problem with, we all have smartphones, we all have things, we have Google Home, we have Alexa, we have all these things that are constantly recording us. And I have a real problem with this, because in 11 states in the United States, it is illegal to surreptitiously record people. And I know that a lot of the people on these teams will say, well, you know, they had the terms and conditions and they had to agree to it and everything, but nobody reads those. And so you have lots of people who are being surreptitiously recorded, possibly in states where it's illegal, and they haven't knowingly given their consent to have that happen. So you need to be really straightforward with people about that, and I feel very strongly about that. So how do you go about finding your participants? Okay, this can seem like a really daunting task after what I just talked about, because, you know, no one's a monolith, right? Like you go to, if you want to say that your target group is people in the United States, okay, well, what varieties of English are you trying to capture? Are you trying to capture Chicano English, African American English, Southern English, Standard English? What is it you want to capture? And then, within each one of those groups, you have differences by gender, you have differences by age, you have all these different ways of talking that can vary based on people. So it can feel kind of overwhelming. So you want to do as much as possible, get a wide range of ages, wide range of genders, wide range of regions, and this can apply to your home country too if you're not from the United States. Wide ranges of ethnicities or races, and ability. And when I say ability, I don't just mean visible disability, I also mean cognitive disabilities and other disabilities that aren't visible. Things like ADHD, things like if you have a word processing disorder or some sort of working memory disorder, something like that, that can make your language use a little bit different than someone who's neurotypical. So the methods that we use in linguistics research, they kind of fall into two camps, right? There's experimental and there's ethnographic. And I'm not going to talk about all these today because, again, we don't have a lot of time. But there's match guides, like the case study that I just talked about. There's discourse completion. There's grammaticality judgments, card sorts, surveys and questionnaires, proficiency assessments. In the ethnographic bucket, we have interviews, observations and recordings, or task-based research methods. And in general, I mean, you can quantify almost anything if you know how to do it, but in general, the experimental methods will be more quantifiable, and the ethnographic methods will be primarily qualitative. So which methods are best for digital products? This is like the prototypical UX answer, right? I don't know, it depends. What are you trying to do? Why are you doing this research? What are your goals? What are you trying to feed into an algorithm? So that means you need to have naturalistic speech. Are you trying to create a chatbot? So you need to validate your dialogues. Why are you doing this? That's going to inform how you choose your method. And how you operationalize your variables. It's really important to think about what your variables are going to be, even generally speaking, before you start collecting your data or designing your research. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're going to have a lot of really messy data. And then how are you going to code it? What is your framework? Again, you don't need to have this written in stone. You can use a top-down or bottom-up approach. Either way works fine, but have a general idea. So I mentioned natural data or naturalistic data. So there's kind of, in the linguistics research, very broadly speaking, there are 3 kinds of buckets that language data fall into. There's natural data, which is like if you go out in the hallway and you have a conversation with someone, that would be natural data. There's no expectation that anything's being recorded or being used for research. It's just a conversation between people, right? Naturalistic data, there is this underlying knowledge that there might be recording happening or something's going to be used for research later, but it's more of a natural interaction. So like maybe you're just having a conversation with someone, you're interviewing them, and they're really comfortable. That would be naturalistic data. Elicited data, you probably kind of get an idea what that means, but it's not usually really spontaneous. It's pretty scripted usually, and that would be something like in a discourse completion task where they have to fill something in. And it's really obvious that's being used for research. So if you're handed a sheet with a discourse completion task, you're doing an assignment and it's obviously for research, whereas if you're being interviewed, it's easier to forget that you're being interviewed for research, especially if you have good rapport with your participant. So I touched on quant versus qual, but I want to talk about it a little bit more. I generally don't recommend that people use quant methods in language research for industry, and the reason why is because, I know with machine learning and AI algorithms and things like that, you want to try to create a model for the language, but you're not creating a theoretical model that other linguists will build on, so you don't necessarily need to quantify in the same way that you would if you were doing actual linguistics research. And it can also obscure a lot of things that you actually want to look at later if you try to quantify. There's an exception, though. I think that general descriptive statistics, percentages, and rates of occurrence are really great tools, and they're easy ways to quantify your data. How many times do people say thank you in a conversation? How many times do people use this one construction to close out a conversation? Things like that. And part of the reason that I don't like, again, if you're not trying to build a model to build upon with future linguistic research necessarily, but quantitative methods also leave out the context. And that's really important. Language is context-based. So the way I'm talking with all of you here today is different than if we were, again, in the hallway chatting after the talk, or in the hotel if we happen to pass each other in the hallway. And it's different from the way that I talk to my spouse or my best friend, or if I were in court talking to a judge. All of those things are going to change. And it's going to change depending on who I'm talking to and what the situation is that we're talking. So if I'm in court and I'm being accused of something and I'm talking to the judge or my lawyer, that's going to be a different kind of language than if I'm, at a bar with my best friend and we're just talking shit about whatever. So, the context is really important, and the quant methods really don't account for that. So you'll want to triangulate your data if you're doing that. And also, for all of you who don't believe this, it's really true that qualitative methods are empirical. I know that that's a struggle with a lot of stakeholders. They just want numbers and they want to see that something's statistically significant, but this is also empirical data, and you can use it to show people how people are using language. Okay, surveys. This is one of my personal bugaboos because I see so many of them written very poorly. It's hard to write surveys well, and if you're good at writing surveys, you know that it's hard to write them well and get the actual information that you need. And so what I usually recommend with people, I feel like some people might get the impulse to ask people to rate, like on a Likert scale, pieces of language. That's not a good idea, because if they get even the slightest whiff of you being disdainful towards their variety, they're going to drop off your survey, you're not going to get data, and it's just going to not go well for you. It'll break trust with your customers or your users if they feel like you hate the way they talk. And you could also get people who are like, well, I hate the way that, I hate that variety of speech, so I'm going to rate it poorly. So you'll have linguistic discrimination coloring your results there too. So you don't actually, what you're going to do is you're going to end up designing a product that's going to end up reinforcing these biases against certain varieties. So I don't recommend people do that. I would recommend sticking to general feelings about conversations or contexts or experiences with language. When have you felt heard? When have you not felt heard? Things like that. Not necessarily using language pieces, and having people rate them. So in general, I feel like people should just stay away from surveys unless you really know what you're doing when you're writing your items, because you don't want to insult people, you don't want to lose trust with your user base or your customers, and you don't want to come across as a company that's completely tone deaf. And also, if you're using a survey and you're saying things like, would you say this in this context? They might say, oh yeah, that sounds right, I would say that. But then in practice, if you were to walk around with them and record them, they don't ever use that construction. So it's not necessarily an accurate result. But if you really need to do them, you want to triangulate with observations for that same reason. Because people will say that they do a thing and then they don't actually do it. So you want to see what they actually do. Again, if you even give off a whiff of disdain, they're just gonna shut down and not finish your survey. So if you're going to do interviews and observations, some of the things you need to consider are you going to record their data? Why are you recording it? Make sure you have a good reason. Are you going to be, again, feeding it into your machine learning algorithm because you want to train your voice algorithm to recognize lots of different people? That's fine. Then you need to record that. Are you recording it because you want to transcribe it later and help flesh out your dialogues for your chatbot? That's fine. But if you're just talking to people for no reason at all, like maybe you're doing design research or discovery research and you're just trying to get some ideas about how people feel about voice interactions or chatbots or things like that, you don't need to record that. Remember that language data is personal data. I wouldn't record people unless you absolutely need it and you have a really good reason to do so. So, and one of the other considerations, so William Labov is considered the father of modern sociolinguistics, and he coined the term observer's paradox, which is really like the Hawthorne effect, if you're aware of that. And basically, he states that the power differential is such that your participant will never actually go into their natural repertoire with you because they know that you're a researcher, and they know that their data is going to be used for research. So you have to be mindful of that. So the likelihood that you'll be getting naturalistic data from people is probably pretty low if you're looking for like closest to actually how they talk. There are ways to mitigate this. If you are a member of that participant's speech community and you're able to switch into that variety, that can help because then they'll feel comfortable like, oh, this person is like me. Again, that doesn't always work though, so be really mindful. It can come across as patronizing or fake. So just be really aware of who your participant is and why you're doing this research. But that can be one way to mitigate that. And then if you do that, if you're interviewing people and you're recording, Labov always states that the first 5 minutes, the user's kind of getting used to, the participant's getting kind of used to being in conversation with you. And the real close to natural language data isn't going to come out until about 5 minutes into the interview. So you want to skip the first 5 minutes of your transcript or your recording and start about 5 minutes in, because that's when they'll start to forget that they're talking to a researcher. And then he also has some other techniques, which is like talk about things that are high affect or high emotion, like death or when they were really scared or something. That's kind of a weird thing to talk about for digital product research. So I don't know if you'd ever use that, but you can keep that in mind if you're designing your scripts. Like if you want to really get, into some more natural conversation, you can think of something that might be high emotion or cause them to really think about something else rather than the fact that they're in an interview with a researcher. Another thing that can help you is if you have a community member that can introduce you or provide the buffer. So in ethnographic linguistics research, we often go into the field and spend time in the community before we even start doing the research, right? Because we want them to trust us, we want them to know who we are, we want them to feel comfortable, and we're not just swooping in, taking their data, and then leaving. Well, that's not always possible with digital product research because we're on shorter timelines, right? So if you have an informant or someone, a trustworthy person in that speech community who can help introduce you to people, sometimes that can help mitigate that discomfort with a stranger coming into the speech community. Okay, so discourse completion tasks. I'm going to go over a couple of methods real quick here. Discourse completion tasks are basically when the participant gives you information on what they would say in a certain situation, and they can be open or they can be closed. An open discourse completion task gives someone a really general scenario, like you're doing this thing and you want to ask for whatever, how would you do that? A closed discourse completion task is like, if anyone's ever taken a language class and you have like the dialogues that you have to fill in with the appropriate verb or something like that, that's what that is basically. So you have like the introduction and like a turn here that's already filled in and then a blank, and they have to say what they would say in response, and then another turn and then another thing they would have to say in response. They can be really easy to write. Writing the items can be a little bit trickier because if you're targeting a certain kind of language, you need to know how to elicit that from people because, for example, with things like the subjunctive in Spanish that are really hard for people to acquire, you have to make a specific situation where they can't avoid it by saying something in the present tense or something in the past tense. You have to set it up as a hypothetical for that to be elicited. But they can be done low cost, quickly, large number of participants. You can send it out like a survey. You can use the input to train your algorithms. You can use it to validate your dialogues or create your dialogues. But there are some cons. There's cons, pros and cons to everything. They don't always reflect what the participant would actually say in that situation. It's probably an idealized version of what they would say in that situation. And so again, if you followed them around, they might not say it like that all the time or ever. Sometimes that happens. It may not capture all the specific utterances for a given context. So like there's a million ways to thank people for something. There's a million ways to greet people. You know, you might not capture everything because what people will tend to do is write the thing that they think you want to hear. These utterances might not apply to a generalized population depending on who's responding to your discourse completion task. You might get a set of people that don't represent the entire spectrum of people that will be using the product. And you can't be guaranteed to be able to localize your data that you obtain from here effectively because a lot of the colloquial ways that we say things don't translate directly into other languages. So you wouldn't necessarily be capturing the variation in your localization target. So you would probably, if you're doing a multilingual product, you'd probably need to do this in several languages, not just rely on one language and then translating it to another. So coding your data, once you have all this data, what do you do with it, right? You want to decide what your units of analyses are. Is it an utterance? Is it a turn? Is it a clause? Is it a phrase? Is it something else? But you'll want to make sure that you have a good idea of that before you start collecting data. And again, you know, I have below here that bottom-up and top-down approaches are both fine. So say you decide that you want your units of analysis to be utterances, and you get your data and you transcribe it and everything looks great, and you're like, okay, yeah, utterances is a great unit of measure. But sometimes you get all of your data and you look at it and you're like, well, shit, this doesn't fit all of the data that I have, so I need to think of a different unit of measure, right? So it's fine to do that. The only thing you need to know is that you have to apply consistently. So if you've coded like all of your transcripts with utterance as your unit of measure, and then you find out that, hey, that's not appropriate, you have to go back and redo everything with your new unit of measure, which is a bummer, but. And so when you're doing this, if you want to learn some conversation analysis transcription methods, that can help you identify your units of measure. This is an example of some data that I collected a few years ago in an intermediate Spanish language classroom. It's okay if you don't understand it. Basically, what I want to point out are the different structures. So, well, that's not working. I was going to point at it. If you see those double bars there with and then below it, yo pienso, that just means that that talk was overlapping. So that's how you signify that the talk was overlapping. The equal signs, so you see after vida and exactamente, those things were right butted up next to each other. So there wasn't any space between when vida ended and exactamente began. So that indicates that there's like adjacency between the turns. And so there's other symbols in here. Conversation analysis provides these tools. I will have more information on how to do this in my book. So if you are interested, there are resources out there for you to learn how to do this. But it can help you figure out how you want to analyze your data. Okay, so I think we're getting to the end. Book info, it should be out late 2019. More information at rosenfeldmedia.com. It's going to be not just about research. It will have more in-depth information about sociolinguistics and language and society interaction, inclusive design for language, how communication works between people, voice-based interactions, all that sort of thing. So if you're interested, let me know, fill out my survey if you would like to help me out in that way. Otherwise, just look for it. And again, feel free to hit me up if you have specific questions. And that's all I have for today. These are my pets, aren't they beautiful? The top left is Ned and Minnie, the middle is Ralph, the top right is Ralph, the bottom left is Ralph and Ned, all three in the middle, and then my cat, Poofy, who was purring at the time, so don't think we're abusing her. I just thought it was really funny, because she's super puffy, Poofy, that's why her name is Poofy, and we pulled her hair down and her head got really small. So,